Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Dale McKinley, who's a political economist. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Is it reasonably possibly true that Russia would have picked up the phone and said to Beijing, please help?
Sure, it's absolutely possible. I mean, if one has been paying attention to the Chinese-Russian relations over the last year, even before the invasion of Ukraine, I think Putin and Xi met about 8 times in the last year. So they've been planning closer relations for a long period of time. And what's clear to everyone now is that Russia is running into problems in Ukraine, militarily, economically, because of the sanctions and so forth. It's not going according to plan, despite their denials to the contrary. So it's not far-fetched to imagine that Putin is going to reach out to Xi and China and say, hey, listen, we're going to need some assistance. Whether that's militarily, maybe, doubtful, maybe on that front, but certainly economically, the sanctions are hitting hard. And China is probably the one country that can probably lessen the impact on Russia to the greatest extent. So yeah, it is definitely possible.
All right, so the relationship between China and Russia is more than political. I mean, economically, it's a huge, huge relationship. I think last year, trade between the two countries was a whopping $147 billion. So this is a relationship that works for both countries. Admittedly, oil and gas and maybe wheat, the major part of all of that. But China is as a country that's quite cautious in how it places itself in the world. And I just wonder if they would help Russia to a point that they risk sanctions themselves.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think they're weighing that up. So far, China's taken the sort of like middle of the road position, saying that we're not going to intervene, but they've sort of silently supported Putin, but essentially called for negotiation and an end to the war. But here's the catch where they could possibly help, which would not bring necessarily sanctions on them, which is that Russia is facing a massive credit squeeze at the moment. They're calling in loans, they owe a lot of money to a lot of creditors. And half of their foreign reserves are locked up as a result of sanctions. Over 300 billion are locked up. So they're going to have a massive squeeze. And this is where China could come in and using yuan, the Chinese currency, because nobody wants to get paid in rubles at this stage. China could assist in that regard without sort of breaking any of the major sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. So I think they could probably find some of those ways around the major sanctions, but I think they'll move very carefully to keep their support of Putin sort of quiet in a sense, but also not anger the West too much, because as you say, they're playing a diplomatic game here, and they don't want to bring too much upon themselves, particularly because China itself is not exactly in the best economic situation at the moment either.
And also China trades with the whole world. Surely for them, especially a country with huge US dollar reserves, a lot of their transactions happen in US dollars, even with the RMB or yuan available to them. They wouldn't want to take on the whole world just to help Russia.
No, one wouldn't think so, and I don't think they will. The Chinese are, and Xi has shown himself to be a very Machiavellian politician, to do basically what's in China's interests and nobody else's, and that's understandable given the situation. So yeah, I think that what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to play, China's big, and Xi in particular, what they want is they want to be a world player. They don't want to play second fiddle to the US all the time. So here's an opportunity for them to become the statespersons, so to speak, the ones that are sort of not caught up too much into the dirt of this war, and to basically say we're above the fray and we're going to bring these two sides. Yes, we have communication with Russia and the United States, and we're going to try to bring you guys together. And in that sense, one of the suggestions that might take off is negotiations through the G20. So as opposed to just Ukraine and Russia going through it, and China plays a major role in that. So I think there's possibilities on that front. But China is not going to do anything drastic or anything off the cuff that's going to affect their own economic situation, and certainly, more importantly, their geopolitical positioning, which is of utmost importance to Xi and the Chinese Communist Party.
Up until now, Russia's energy, particularly exports, were going into Europe. This was the major consumer of their exports. They've been trying over time to reduce that independence and looking towards Russia. But I suppose this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because Russia then would become their single biggest market, and you don't want to be too dependent on one country, surely.
No, and Russia's not exactly an economic powerhouse. I mean, you know, Russia's got some advantages: raw materials, oil, and some of the minerals, and some certain agricultural products. But as a world economic player, it's not particularly up there, and even in the top 10, really, if we think about it. So Russia's not going to be your best economic partner. I think what Xi and China and others would see it as is a geostrategic partner. Clearly, what they want to do is they want to get together with Russia and push the US out of their spheres of influence. This is what the Ukrainian war is really all about for Putin. And Xi is looking at Taiwan and his neighborhood in the same sense. So they'll play the geopolitical game much closer, but on the economic realm, if they want to keep their growth rates up, and they certainly want to keep up the Chinese economy as the sort of growth engine of the world, they're not going to go too close to Russia and risk that, you know, going in a wrong direction.
One gets a sense that even if this gets resolved in the near future, things will never be the same again. Relationships have been tested, and countries are now starting to make decisions. I mean, we saw Germany and that pipeline, they stopped that deal. I mean, that is huge. Germany shifted quite a bit from its almost hardened position with regards to how it deals with Russia. Will we ever get back to pre-Ukraine, or is there a new order on the way, a realignment of political forces?
Well, that realignment, Peter, has been going on for quite some time. I think what the Ukrainian war has just turbocharged it. So what we have is a situation where the United States empire, the global sort of unipolar world, post-Soviet Union, is falling apart. It's being contested not just by the larger powers such as China and Russia, but by a whole range of other regional powers. I mean, all we have to do is look at the Middle East. We can look at North Africa and many other places, and even in South America, where the United States influence is waning, both politically as well as militarily. So in that sense, we are in the transitional period. And that's why it's so unpredictable, because, as you say, countries are making decisions that, a few years ago would have been almost unimaginable in this case, because they're not quite sure where things are going to end up. I mean, is Putin going to go completely rogue and start, he's threatened nuclear use of nuclear weapons? One would think, no way that's going to happen, but we never thought the Ukraine war was going to happen either. And so in that sense, I think what it's a world which is shifting alliances, allegiances, and moving around. And for us here in South Africa, the real fundamental question is, does this open up an opportunity for that sort of non-aligned, more sort of third worldism that used to have quite a lot of currency in the 70s and 80s to come back and to be another pole of power in the world, as opposed to simply just fighting it out between East and West?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting to observe the reactions of Africans and African nations over this conflict. On the face of it, you cannot invade another country. However, people have been finding ways to justify it. And even when you see hospitals being bombed, again, a story comes out to justify it. And I'm just wondering, even BRICS, after this, where are we at? Because Brazil voted for the UN resolution to condemn Russia.
Well, I think that was more a function of internal Brazilian politics than anything else, because Bolsonaro is facing an election coming up, and he's probably going to lose. But yes, the question is appropriate. It's an appropriate one. I mean, I think many of us thought right from the beginning of the formation of BRICS that South Africa was sort of the odd one out. I mean, first of all, if you look at all the others, they're major economies, fairly, outside of Brazil, military and economic powers in the world, almost half the world's population in the other countries. And here's us, relatively small, relatively insignificant. So in some ways, this also presents an existential crisis for an organization like BRICS. What is its role? I mean, if it's hasn't been even really heard of at the moment, there's really nothing other than what we've seen with President Ramaphosa being asked maybe to be part of these negotiations, and that's about it. So in some ways, this transition that we're talking about the shifting of alliances, might have the impact of breaking BRICS up, not formally, but certainly as any kind of what it was envisioned, which was an alternative sort of political and economic pole, precisely because of what this Ukraine situation is showing us is that nationalism is triumphing over globalism, and that's the fundamental change that's also taking place, that is throwing up a whole range of unpredictable consequences.
All right, perhaps as a final question, they're in talks, and it looks like both sides desperately need a solution. Putin would want to come out of this appearing as if he's a victor, Ukraine as if they fought to the last man, they didn't give up. I'm not sure how they get across the finish line in circumstances such as this. How do you see this playing out? And I'm also thinking about what happens in Israel sometimes when the conflict escalates. Israel goes into Gaza and bombs and bombs and bombs, and America says, please leave. And then they carry on until they've reached a certain level of destruction, and then they pull out. Is this what Russia might be doing, where they go in, destroy, and then at some point pull out and then try and patch things up again, but the destruction will have happened?
Well, it takes us back to right at the beginning of when everybody was wondering whether Putin was going to invade or not. And what the Russian foreign ministry and the military was saying at the time was that one of the goals, if we do invade, is going to be to militarily decapitate Ukraine, essentially to basically destroy their military infrastructure because they're a threat to Russia. Now, if one takes that, that would make sense in the sense that Russia can go in there, they can basically grind it down. They can grind the Ukrainian military down, bomb the cities, leave it to the point of saying, of course, we're not going, they realize, I think, that they're not being an occupying power is not going to work. They would face guerrilla war, they would face constant resistance. It would be a quagmire like Afghanistan was to the Soviets. And the US has experienced that as well. So I would see a situation where you would have a negotiated settlement where Russia would say, we're going to take Donbass and the republics in the eastern part of the country. You're going to have to accept these sort of conditions about your military and your strategic positioning. And Ukraine would probably have to be in a position to accept some of these things while keeping their degrees of sovereignty of what was be left of Ukraine. And then Russia would come in, and ironically, as you mentioned, in the Middle East, what happens is oftentimes those that are the destroyers come and then they make a lot of money rebuilding the very place they destroyed. So in many cases, I think that's probably what's going to happen. I don't think Russia's end game here is to completely wipe out the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian nation as such. I don't think that's a real option for them. I think there's going to have to be negotiation. The question is, how much is Ukraine going to have to give up, and how much is Russia going to get out of this in terms of what they originally went in for, which was to secure their NATO flank.
All right, Dr. Del McKinley, we're going to have to leave it there. Always good talking to you. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Thank you.